Okay, so our project has now been created. Now different versions of Android Studio start up showing a different file. Now I've got the main activity Java file open, and you can see activity_main up here next to it on the tab at the top. Now sometimes activity_main will be the one initially displayed, but it doesn't really matter because you can just click on the tab to switch between them, like so anyway. Now if you remember, these are the names that we gave to the files in the last screen in the previous video, or rather the names that Android Studio suggested and that we accepted. Now there's a lot of things to talk about on the screen, but looking at it, you might be thinking, wow, where do I start with all of this? But the thing to keep in mind with a lot of this is, there's a lot of information on the screen, but you don't need to understand a lot of it straight away. Now as we go through the course, for example, you'll understand what layouts are and widgets and so forth. Now we'll cover that in a later video, but just keep in the back of your mind that Android Studio application is extremely powerful, and it does enable you to create very complex applications. You don't need to know a lot about those advanced things yet, and in fact we're not going to be using some of those until later in the course, but I will be explaining things as I go along. So if you keep in mind that you can't understand everything at once, then it will make a lot of sense eventually. Going through some of the fundamental things though, I'm going to show you how to make a few little changes before the next video where we run this particular application. Now the first thing I'd like to mention is the rendering error that you can get if you've installed a preview version of the Android SDK. So it's generally not a good idea to install preview versions while you're learning, because you can't always be sure if the error is a result of your code or a bug in the SDK. So firstly though, here's a screenshot showing an error displaying the activity_main layout using the Android N preview version before the Android N official version was actually released. Now this doesn't look good, and if that's the first thing you see when starting Android Studio, then it may well be a bit scary and off-putting. Now there are bugs in preview versions because if there were no bugs, they'd release it and it wouldn't be a preview version anymore. But with that said, seeing things like that when you're all new to this can be scary. And actually, if you stop and think about it, it's obvious that the problem isn't something that you've done because you haven't entered any code yet, so the bug can't be yours. That doesn't really help though because you still don't know what to do about it. So as a general rule, avoid preview versions until you've had a lot of experience and have become confident in sorting out problems. Now it's possible that you might get a rendering error even if you're not using a preview version. That does happen from time to time, and this screenshot shows the particular error I'm thinking of. Now if you get something like that, the fix is to go to the File menu and choose the option to invalidate caches /restart. Alright, so back in Android Studio, if you did see an error like that, immediately after creating a new project or even after opening one that was previously working, you just come up to File and select this invalidate caches restart option, and that should fix the problem for you. Now the good news is that errors like that seem to be less common in Android Studio 3. However, Google changes things all the time and they do sometimes introduce new bugs. Okay, so let's have a look what some of these other things are. So I'm going to start with the layout. Now you can see at the top there's a few buttons. The first one I want to draw your attention to is a button that lets you choose which version of Android is used for the display. So it's a button that's above the images when you're editing a layout file. So in other words, you need to have a layout file open, activity_main in this case. And what I'm going to do is come over here and click on this project pane to give us a bit more space by closing that down. And you can see over here that the one I'm talking about, it's got a picture of Android and a number. In this case, it's got the number 27 or O, and that tells us that we're running API 27 running Android 8. Now that may well be the only option you have, and that's great because you really don't need to have an earlier version as I've mentioned. But I've actually got API 24, 26 and 27 on my computer, and I can switch between those versions if I wanted to. But generally, I recommend you only need to specify the latest released version and only have that version on your computer. Now, in case it's not obvious, you do need to install the SDK for any version that you want to use for the preview. Now, the other thing is, you may recall when we set up the wizard, it asked for names and we left the layout name activity_main. Now, a layout is a file that specifies how the various parts of the screen are laid out. Android Studio lets you modify the layout, either by using this graphic designer or by modifying the XML that represents all the objects on the screen. So think of a layout as a screen definition, and by changing the layout, you define what the screen looks like and what it contains. Now over to the left here are all the widgets that we can add to the screen. So you can see text widgets, various buttons, and other things like progress bars and spinners. And so scroll down, you can see all of these different things. Quite a lot of widgets you can add, text fields for getting input, various containers and image widgets, a whole host of things that you can use when creating the screens for your apps. Now you can make a lot of changes in the design view by dragging widgets onto the layout. So for example, I can go back up to the top. So I can drag a button and drop it onto the layout, for example. Now we're going to be doing that soon, so I'm just going to delete that for now. You can also edit the XML, which is the format that the file is stored in. So if I come down here and click on the text tab, you can see the XML representation of our layout. Now with Android Studio 2.2, Google set out to make it possible to create even complicated layouts without ever having to modify the XML, and they've almost succeeded. There's still at least one reason that you'll have to edit this XML, unless you want to scrap the entire layout and start again, but on the whole you don't have to edit the XML to get things done. Now it can be a quicker way to create multiple similar widgets, such as an array of buttons for a calculator app for example, but you can achieve just about everything without having to know XML. Now if you already are familiar with XML, then what you're seeing should look fairly straightforward. We can see that the basic screen type is a constraint layout, with attributes setting things like its width and height. And included in the constraint layout is a text view with its text set to hello world. Now this can look a bit complicated if you haven't seen XML before, so I'm going to come over here and click on the design tab to switch back. And you can see over here we've got something called the component tree to the left, and that pretty much echoes what we saw in the XML view. At the top is our activity underscore main constraint layout. Contained within the constraint layout is our text view. And when I click on that text view over here on the screen, you can see it gets highlighted for us automatically in the left in the component tree. And that works the other way too. So if I click on something in the component tree, it also gets selected on the screen in both the design and blueprint parts of the previous screen. There's also a load of attributes for the thing that we've selected over to the far right. So I've got the text view selected over there. You can come over here, you can see that we've got the text property over here set to hello world. So I can change it here. If I start typing I was here, for example, once I press enter, you can see the changes are reflected on the screen. When I press enter, the text view automatically expands as I type more text as well. So if I come back here and add a space on the end, type in today, press enter, you can see it's expanded to fit the extra text. Basically, you saw it got wider on the blueprint and the full text appears on both the design and the blueprint previous screens. Now, there are other ways of changing that, including using the strings.xml file in the res values folder. That's probably outside of the scope of this first video. So what I have done is shown you a way to update the text, and we'll be doing that, but there are other ways that make it easier to make your app available in other languages. Now, you probably wouldn't change it on a real application by just over-typing like I did, but we'll be covering that later in the course. But that way will get us going for now. Now what you're seeing is only a sample selection of properties, the ones that you probably want to change most often. You can get access to all the properties by coming up here and by clicking up these two arrows up here. Now this version of Android Studio defaults to showing the XML attributes editor when you first run it. So what we've got here are the attributes that you've currently defined or that have been defined for us by the template. Now in previous versions of Android Studio, all the attributes appeared in an alphabetical list. Now this makes life much easier because you can scroll through and check out any attributes that sound interesting. With the release of Android Studio 3, however, that I'm using, that list doesn't appear straight away. Instead, we've got the attributes that we've changed, even if we change them without being aware of it in the template. You can see things like the layout width and the layout height showing on the screen. There's also a text attribute and also the constraints, which you may not have been aware that you've changed. So really what this is a concise view of the attributes being used at the moment. So if you know what attribute you want to change, it's also very easy to set it in here. You just type in the blank row to make it happen. This concise view is great when you know what you want to change, but it isn't very helpful when you're learning about all this. Fortunately, Google have also made the complete list available. To do that, all you need to do is click on this cog drop down up here and select All Attributes Table. And that changes to the same view that earlier versions of Android Studio had, and we can now scroll down through the list. So in other words, you can choose which view to use here. As you get more experienced, you may want to use the XML attribute editor layout that we had before, and you can access that again by just clicking on the cog like we did. There's all sorts of things you can change here, but I'm going to go back and select all attributes table again. So basically in this mode, there's all sorts of things that you can change here. The one interesting set are the constraints. You can see this at the top there. If I click on this little arrow, that'll expand the list of options. And you can see there's quite a lot of them. And you can make that pane wider, by the way, by dragging its edge if you want to see what the names are. That moves everything over if you can't see the full names. But if you're short of screen space, you can switch off the design or blueprint images using the select design surface button just above them. So I could come up to here if I wanted to and choose just design or choose just blueprint. And you could scroll this over a little bit more depending on the amount of screen real estate you have. But I'm going to come back and choose both of them. And in general, each pane in Android Studio has a button that can be used to shrink it out of the way so that you can use the full space on your screen to focus on what you're doing. Now at the moment we're designing a layout and we don't need to see all the files in the project. You'll notice that each separate pane has a button that looks like a bar. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to bring back the project pane by clicking on this tab again. It's this little button over here that I'm talking about. So clicking this button will shrink the pane in the direction of the arrow. You can see if you look at that carefully, the arrow is pointing to the left. The idea of that is to give you an indication of where to look to get it back. So you can see the button that will get the pane back just by looking in the direction of the arrow. So for this project pane, the arrow points left. Over to the left, you can see it's got $1:project appearing to the left. So if I click on that now to close it, I can click on $1:project to open it again. So you can do the same thing with the panes that open up along the bottom of Android Studio. For example, I can open up the logcat window and come over here. You can see that we've got a downwards pointing arrow this time. And incidentally, don't worry about what logcat is at the moment. This is about controlling the individual panes, and you'll be seeing what they will do later. So at the far right is the button to shrink this pane with the arrow pointing downwards to show which way it will shrink. So we know how to get it back again. So I can close it down again. And if I open it up again, and also come over here and click on the event log, they both appear next to each other. And again, I can just use the buttons to shrink them. So there's a lot going on in Android Studio and it can look very confusing, but you control which panes you see and you can shrink any that you're not interested in. Really, that lets you just focus on the work you want to do. So I've closed down those two bottom panes. I'm also going to shrink down the project pane again so that we can focus on our layout. Now, I was looking at the constraints before I started opening and closing panes. The constraints do look a little bit confusing, but these long names are intended to describe what each one does. So for example, the first one's bottom to bottom of, up here, which tells you that it'll be to line the bottom of our text view up with the bottom of something else, which is what this first constraint does, but you can also line the bottom of it up with the top of something, so there's the bottom to top of over here, which we could also use about halfway down. Now that would align the bottom of the text view with the top of another object on the screen. You can also align the left or right of a widget with the left or right of another widget to position things where you need them. So lining everything up in here would soon get tedious, and there's fortunately a much easier way that I'm going to show you shortly when we've got a few more controls on the screen. Now you want to come in here to check and maybe change a few things though, especially on a slow computer or if you've only got a small screen. So don't worry about what these constraints mean. You don't have to remember them all. Once you've lined up a few things, it'll make a lot more sense. And I will be coming back to this and we'll be using this layout view a lot throughout the course, so you will get plenty of practice. For now, I just wanted to quickly show you where you'd go to make changes to the layout for the apps. So I'm going to click on this double arrow now to go back to the common properties and also to get some screen real estate back. And I can also move this over again if I want to make them a little bit bigger. Okay, over to the left of these buttons, over here, is the one that you can toggle the layout into landscape, which is great for checking how things will look when the device is rotated. I can come over here and click on and switch to landscape. And again, we'll be coming back to this layout editor in the next video. The other thing though I wanted to show you is the project pane. This is where you can choose which files you want to work on. So I'm going to just go back to landscape mode again. I'm going to bring back this project pane. So I can come over here and expand app, and then expand Java. And finally, our package name, academy.learnprogramming.helloworld. If I do that, expand that, we can see our Java files. Now under Res, there's a layout folder. We click on that, and that's where our layout's stored. So in here are all the files that are associated with the project. And again, that'll make more sense as we go through the course, but the clever thing is that Android Studio has created all of this for us, saving a lot of time. Now the Java file main activity has the code that Android Studio generated for us, and I went through this briefly in the video on templates. There's not much in this one as we open it. That's because we chose the empty activity template, but you will see this line that uses the activity_main layout. So that's one way that the layout files are used to create the display for our apps. So Android Studio has created the basic code for our app with a layout to define the screen and the code to display it when we run the app. So that's part of the beauty of Android Studio. It does a lot of this work for us, saving us a lot of time when we're creating our applications. So that was a really quick tour of Android Studio, and we will be looking at it in much greater detail as we go through this course. Before you can do much experimenting though, you need to be able to run your app to see how the things you're trying out really behave. So in the next video, we're going to run this app using the emulator that we installed in a previous video. And then in the video after that one, I'm going to show you how that runs on a physical Android device. So I'll see you in the next video.